So this week we're talking about using tasks as custom fields. We're going to cover basically how you use them to track any custom information. Sometimes you might want to or desire a field to be required to make sure that someone enters. So we're going to cover how to mimic that with your tasks. So let's first talk about the tasks themselves. The reason you're able to utilize the tasks to mimic fields is because they're so versatile. Basically, they are just fields where you can track whatever it is you need to track. So by using the methods that I'm about to outline, they'll allow you to kind of massage them into allowing you to collect custom data for that. Okay, let me hop over to Pipeline. Okay, so the way that you set them up to require or gather certain information is by basically setting up a task as you normally would and setting it up to be auto-assigned so that it can get the information you need and also be completely hands-free in doing so. So let me hop over to my checklists page. I'm just going to go into a random checklist template here. So what I would do here is, again, I'm utilizing my tasks to get the information that I need. So I would start by, let's just pick this task here. I want to give it a task name, specifically what I want the person to do, whether that is enter the list price or add a title company contact, whatever it is I want the person to do on that transaction. So in this case, let me go ahead and say enter list price. Okay. The second thing I want to do is to give it a due date, a relative due date here. So in this case, maybe I want that list price entered as soon as the transaction is created. So I'm going to assign it a relative due date, and I'm going to actually say I want this to be due on the transaction creation date. Okay, and set that date rule. So I want that list price to be entered on the transaction creation date. So that's one way, is when I need it to be due immediately as soon as the transaction is created. I could want it to be due at some date in the future. Maybe I want the sale price to be entered, right? So then maybe I'll do that at some different date, at the acceptance date, right? So whatever other date I want to specify, I can enter the relative due date rule. Or if it's going to be a custom date that's going to be entered each time, or a hard date, then I can not have a due date rule at all, and then that can end up being specified on the actual transaction. But for the purposes of really trying to require this information to be entered, generally you want a due date. Okay, so I'm going to set that to be due on the transaction creation date. And then I want to be sure that this checklist is set to be automatically assigned. Again, making this even more convenient because it'll be completely hands-free so that the task gets there automatically, gets required automatically. Okay? And the result of this is going to be that the agent or user is going to get that task that they need to have done. It'll appear on their task list. They'll get their daily reminders if it starts to get close to being due or past due. So they've got both the task that's showing for them as well as the nudge, which in some cases is even better than just having it be a standard field on there, because you're getting those reminders. Or in some cases where if you wanted it to be required, there may be cases where they don't have that information and can't save it until they do because it's required. This will allow them to proceed without entering it, but still get that nudge. Okay, so that's how it works. Let me tell you one common question that we get, and that is, how do I require the contacts to be entered? You can still use the same method. Instead of maybe enter list price, maybe your task is to add the lender to contacts. And I'm going to open a transaction in a different tab here, just in case there's anyone who doesn't know that the contacts are added separately up here. Here is where you add contacts, right? So whenever you want a contact to be added, you want it to be added in this section. You don't want them to necessarily be typed into, let's say, the more info field or some other field. You want them to be tracked here, because once they're contacts, you've got lots of different things that you can do with them. For example, dragging them to as the recipient, or dragging their contact information to messages, etc. And also they're available at a glance up here. So whenever you want a contact to be entered, use that same method, and then just dictate exactly what you want to have happen there. And then again, they'll get those reminders to do so either immediately or whenever you set the due date for them. Okay. And then the last part that I want to tell you about is how you can use these combined with the more info field. So let me hop back over to a transaction here, and let me edit this transaction. And in your more info field, the more info field is used to store any information that's not stored elsewhere. So if you are wanting to require or track some additional information beyond the fields that exist here, here is where you would do it. So when I'm using those checklist tasks to dictate that they enter information into the transaction, typically I'm wanting them to enter it into here. So if I said, for example, add escrow number to more info field, that's how I would specify that they do that. Okay. Now there's an additional way to help ensure that that information gets there, and that's by defaulting that information into the more info field. So let's say this said escrow number, right? If this information were in the more info field, a person is probably more likely to realize, hey, I need to enter my escrow number, right? Of course, they could type that themselves, but there's an even better way of the master admin ensuring that that happens, and that is under the admin settings page. Let me open that in a separate tab here. I can specify default more info information. As you can see, there's several pieces of information we're already gathering by default here. So if I were to, including agent's license number, refer contact information, etc. So if I were to say escrow number additionally, and then save that, each time I add a new transaction, like I just did here by clicking that, it's going to include that default value that I've got there, set up there under the admin area. So that combining that this default more info information along with those setting up those tasks to enter information into the more info field will really help solidify getting that information into there and nudging the person when it's time to actually, or the deadline has passed to actually do so. Okay. And that's it for just kind of the nuts and bolts of how to use the tasks to force that information as your own custom fields or as your required fields.